Yeah, right now it's just like I have to yeah, I mean it's okay, like it's pretty.
Look in the fridge, right?
And sometimes I think we'll see how that goes. Junior, sophomore year.
I was thinking that if I were to go out, maybe I would go back to the
No, I think I have it twice a year. I always, in the spring I never have to.
I see.
In the summer, I go to
They're going to hear this start to be one of the coming in. Yeah, I'm sure. Let them sit down. I don't know what they want to do. Yeah, just go. Yeah, I'm absolutely fine. That's fine. That's right. Unless the fire marshal says something. Okay.
I'll trust you with that. You look like the honest type.
Not a problem, my friend.
Good evening, everyone. We seem to be blessed with one of those happenings that all event planners kind of like, but kind of dread, is we have a lot of people who've come to this event. I want to thank you all for coming. We still have more coming in. If you have an empty seat beside you, you could slide in a little bit and offer a seat. That'd be a very nice thing. Of course, you don't have to. Plenty of seats up front. But first of all, please let me thank you all for coming tonight to the Academy on Capitalism and Limited Government Funds talk tonight by Robert Lawson. Let me tell you a little bit about Robert Lawson. Robert Lawson is the Jerome M. Fullinwider Endowed Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom in the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom in the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. Prior to SMU, he taught at Auburn University, Capital University, and Shawnee State University. Dr. Lawson is co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World annual reports, which present an economic freedom index for over 140 countries. Lawson has numerous professional publications in journals including Public Choice, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Cato Journal, Kyplos, Journal of Labor Research, Journal of Institutional and Theoretical Economics, and the European Journal of Political Economy. Lawson is past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education and a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. He earned his BS in Economics from the Honors Tutorial College at Ohio University and his MS and PhD in Economics from Florida State University. In his spare time, he enjoys running marathons and ultramarathons, mountaineering, vintage baseball, and cooking. And so I would like to ask you all now to help me in welcoming Robert Lawson.
Thank you very much, Bill. That introduction is exactly how I wrote it for you this morning. There are a lot of seats. You want to come up front. It's the best seat in the house, like business class up here. Lots of labor. No free drinks, though. Sorry. Well, there's a lot of people here, and I know why. Extra credit is awesome. I promise I will do my best to make this extra credit experience as painless as possible, and hopefully enjoyable, and hopefully something you will think a little bit about as you leave this evening and talk to all the people that didn't come to this wonderful lecture. You can talk to them and tell them what they missed out on. The title of the talk, as you can see, is Decline of Economic Freedom. That's sort of a hook to get people here. I will talk a little bit about the decline of economic freedom in the United States, but mostly I just want to talk about economic freedom and how we measure it. And before I do that, though, I want to tell sort of a little story. I started to say it wasn't too long ago that I was a college student, but it was a few years now. But when I was a student at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, I remember having wonderful debates with my friends, my college friends, my chums. I was a kind of a young Republican at that time. I was wearing blue blazers back then, too. And my friends, though, most of my friends were, I don't know if I should call them socialists, or they were Democrats at the very least. And we would have wonderful debates about how we thought the world should be, how we thought the economy should be organized, how we thought society should be organized. And that great debate that I'd like to describe here, I'm going to frame it around two gentlemen. You can see the two pictures there. On the left, well, I guess it's on the right. Which way? On your left, we have Adam Smith. Adam Smith is kind of a hero of mine. I'm actually wearing my Adam Smith lapel pin. I have ties with this picture on it. Everything's ridiculous. And Adam Smith, famous Scottish economist, probably you've heard of him, wrote two great books. The one book that we talked the most about was called The Wealth of Nations, Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in that book, Smith advocated what he called a system of natural liberty. A system of natural liberty. That was his term for it. It's kind of an 18th century term. Today, I'm going to use the term economic freedom. And what Smith meant by a system of natural liberty, or what I mean today by economic freedom, is basically what we would casually call capitalism. Free markets, laissez-faire, some word like that. The essence of it is private property as the foundation for the economy. In terms of the role of government, it's a limited role for government. Not to say no government, taxes. Adam Smith had a whole chapter on all the things government should do. But for Adam Smith, the role of government was a very circumscribed, a very limited role. Adam Smith's role for government was have some cops, keep the peace, have some judges to settle contracts or to settle disputes. Maybe build some roads and bridges, although he said they should be toll roads and toll bridges. And yeah, schools are okay, but beyond that, there isn't a lot that Adam Smith thought the government should do. So Adam Smith advocated this system of natural liberty with a small but limited, a real but a limited role for government. He advocated for free trade. He had the audacity, which is in the 18th century, he had the audacity to argue that the people of England should be allowed to freely trade with the people in France, bitter enemies for centuries. And of course, we're still having debates about free trade in the United States and the modern world today. So that's Adam Smith said. Adam Smith said, you know, if you follow this vision, if you follow this natural liberty business, this economic freedom business, the world will work pretty good. The wealth of the nation will be greater. Things will work. It'll be a good society. That was Adam Smith. Roughly speaking, 100 years later, a little less than 100 years later, another guy came along, Karl Marx. Dashing figure here. Yeah, okay, not a dashing figure. Karl Marx, he was reading the stuff that Smith wrote. He was reading stuff that other economists that followed Smith, like Ricardo and wrote. And he said, you know, these economists are wrong. This capitalism stuff is actually going to be a problem. It's going to create all kinds of problems. It's going to cause business cycles, recessions, unemployment, poverty, monopoly, a litany of bad things would happen if you follow this natural liberty, this economic freedom, this capitalism stuff. So we have one guy, we have Adam Smith saying, if you follow this capitalism, this economic freedom thing, it won't be the land of milk and honey, but it'll be nice, it'll work. And then Marx coming along a few generations later saying, no, it won't work. All right, so that's the debate. I remember that debate with my college friends in college. And I was an Adam Smith friend, a guy, and my friends were Marxists or something like Marxists. They were critical of the way in which market economies work. And the debate I remember with my friends, and oh, by the way, OU is very highly ranked on the annual party school list. I don't know where Illinois is, but OU is always in the top 5. And in fact, we lost our #1 ranking this year. I'm quite mad at the students there. As a proud alumnus, they need to get that #1 ranking back. But that debate, frequently occurring with the assistance of liquid encouragement, was a lot like those two people down there screaming at each other. I would say something like, oh, you know, I think we really need to cut taxes. They would say, no, we need to raise taxes. I would say, you know, private property is good. They said, no, private property means selfishness. And a couple more years later, they would start to call me names. They would call me a greedy capitalist pig. And I would say, you're a pico commie. And the whole debate, which was actually kind of fun and enjoyable, at the end of my 3 years, I graduated in 3 years. At the end of my 3 years at OU, I I don't think I convinced a single person that I was right. None of my friends turned into free market economists like me, and likewise, they had almost no influence on my thinking as well. So as fun and as enjoyable as those evening debates were with my colleagues, my friends, we really didn't, it wasn't really a debate that actually got us to some kind of resolution. And I'd like you to think about how that debate it would be, how debates go on in other areas. So I've got a couple guys in a lab over here. And I don't know what they're doing, but I'm imagining that they're arguing perhaps or discussing what happens when you mix a couple chemicals together. And maybe the one guy thinks that if you mix the chemicals together, you'll get a smell of roses, perfume. Whereas the other guy thinks if you mix those chemicals together, you'll get a smell of rotten eggs, a horrible smell. Now, you could imagine that these two people could argue about it. Maybe they would write papers for prestigious chemistry journals, and all kinds of calculus and analytical chemistry stuff. And they could argue and argue for decades, even centuries. But what are they eventually going to do? Of course, they're going to go down to the lab, right? They're going to mix the chemicals together. And if the chemicals smell like roses, then the one guy's right. If they smell like rotten eggs, then the other guy's right. And if they smell like either of those things, then they're both wrong, and you both need to write your papers. But at the end of the day, the way in which we sort of reach truth, or we get closer to truth in the natural sciences is through theory on the one hand, but also appeals to empirical evidence, appeals to laboratory experiments and empirical evidence. All too often, the social sciences is just like those two people screaming at each other. In economics, political science, sociology, the other social sciences, it's a lot of yelling at each other, a lot of name calling, not a lot of actual dispassionate science going on. Now, economics is not a natural science. There are deep and fundamental differences between social sciences and natural sciences. But I would like to ask us to think about making the natural sciences a little bit more like the social sciences a little bit more like the natural sciences. Take a page out of their playbook and act like those guys in the lab. Right. So, thinking in those terms, then, great debate. One guy, Adam Smith, said that if you follow his system of natural liberty, the world will work pretty well. Karl Marx said, if you follow that system of natural liberty, that economic freedom thing, it won't work. It'll be a disaster. People will be poor. We'll have inequality, we'll have monopoly, we'll have all kinds of horrible things. So let's act like scientists and try to measure economic freedom first. If we can measure economic freedom, if we can put a number on how economically free different countries are, the unit of analysis here is going to be countries. If we can put a number on how economically free countries are, then we might be able to say, well, ask the question, well, do countries that have more economic freedom, like Smith advocated, are they better or are they worse? Let's not argue ideologically, let's look at the data. So 25 years ago, with my co-author Jim Gortney, I'm very pleased that tomorrow in Lake College up in Wisconsin I get to give a little talk in honor of Jim. And Jim and I started this project trying to measure economic freedom. And for the last 20 years or so, we've been putting out an economic freedom index. The goal of which is to put a number on how close you are to Adam Smith. Okay? So that's the idea. Now, it is pretty complicated. A lot of numbers. I got the book somewhere over here. If I showed it to you, it's pages and pages of tables filled with nothing but numbers. What I do is I collect data. I collect data from regular sources. I don't make it up. I go to the World Bank and the IMF. I use a lot of data from the World Economic Forum, which is a private group in Switzerland. You may have heard of the WEF. They have a big famous meeting in Davos. And prime ministers and kings and queens and Bono actually goes to the World Economic Forum meeting. So rock stars get to go to that. I'm waiting for my invitation, but they still haven't invited me. So I use data from these sorts of international groups, nothing really special about it. But we collect data on, again, trying to put a number on how close you are to Adam Smith. Remember, Adam Smith said we should have low taxes, we should have free trade, we should have private property, we should have limited role for government in terms of regulation. And I've got data on these things. I've got data on government spending, data on trade policy, tariffs, and quotas. Adam just said you should have small government in terms of taxes, you should have small tariffs, you should have limited regulations, you should have free trade. Okay, so I collect 42 variables from many, many different sources, primarily, as I said, IMF, World Bank, PricewaterhouseCoopers, WEF, World Economic Forum, things like that. I won't go through all 42 variables. You'd be falling asleep on me here. And this is the World Series game tonight, right? So we'll get to that, okay. So let me just cut to the chase then. In terms of 5 areas, these 42 variables are really collapsed into 5 areas. So if you want to do well on my index, here's what you want to do. You want to be small in terms of government. Small taxes, low taxes, relatively low government spending. I find 5 variables for that in that area. Legal structured property rights, basically private property. There's a really cool data set done by the World Bank called the Doing Business Project. And it's put out by the World Bank. They have data, for example, on how long it takes to settle a contract dispute. So if I had a contract with one of you and I belched on the deal, I didn't pay you the money that I owed you. The question is, how long would it take for the court in that country to make me give you the money that I owe you? In the United States, the estimate is 1 year. In some countries, it's 3,000 days. Think about that. 3,000, that's like a decade. That's a decade. So if you had a contract dispute with somebody in a country like that, it would take a decade to get your money out of the courts. Well, realistically, of course, what's going to happen is no one's going to go to the courts. You're going to hire a thug to go enforce that contract privately. And next thing you probably won't enter into the contract in the first place. Knowing that you can't enforce it, if it goes wrong, you probably won't even enter into the contract. You've all heard of 30-year mortgages? Do you have any idea how special that is? What a special contract a 30-year mortgage is? A 30-year mortgage, some bank is going to give you, one of you people right now, just a few years from now, you guys are all really young, right, most of you, you're going to go to a bank in a few years and ask some banker for $300,000. He's going to give it to you on the promise. All you're going to do is you're going to promise to pay him a little bit back every year for the next 30 years. Guess what? Most people in the world can't get 30-year mortgages. Only a tiny fraction of the earth has a capital market that is good enough and has a court system efficient enough to allow that kind of trust to exist. Mexico now has 30-year mortgages. They just started getting them a few years ago. But until just a few years ago, even Mexicans could not get a 30-year mortgage because the courts, no one trusted the courts. No banker would lend you $300,000, knowing that the court wouldn't enforce the contract if you stopped making payments and the bank took you to court. The court's not going to enforce it. So critical ingredient to any market economy, the system of natural liberty, system of economic freedom, critical is the property rights and court systems are the guardians of property rights. The third area in the index is sound money. Basically, this is inflation. Measures a few different things, but it's basically all about inflation. I'll move on quickly. Freedom to trade. This was Adam Smith's famous area. The wealth of nations, in many ways, was a plea to the English nation to open up trade with other people, particularly with continental Europe, France, and so on. And so in this area, we have measures of tariffs and quotas. We have some capital control measures from the IMF. And then lastly, we've got a lot of different measures. I think we have 12 or 13 different measures in that fifth area related to regulations of different kinds. In credit markets, banking regulations like interest rate controls. In labor markets, regulations like minimum wages. One of my favorites in there is conscription, military conscription, which is a type of regulation that forces you to work for the Army instead of whoever you would have worked for otherwise. And then we have business regulations of a more general nature, like how many days or how many procedures it takes to start a business, again, from the Doing Business Project. So 42 variables, but to do well in the index, you want to get small government, private property, low inflation, low tariffs, and limited regulations. If this was a smaller audience, I'd ask, what do you think number one is? But I'll go ahead and give it to you. Number one is Hong Kong. Easy call. Easy call. Hong Kong is as close as any place on earth has ever gotten to Adam Smith's vision. I think it is we call it an economic freedom index, but I call it in my head it's an Adam Smith index. And it's out of 10. You can see the numbers are out of 10. So a 10 would be Adam Smith. Hong Kong gets a 9 out of 10. The top tax rate in Hong Kong is 15%. That's the rich people rate, 15%. In the United States, depending on the state you live in, the top tax rate is probably 50%. It's probably 50% in Illinois, high tax state, probably about 40% federal, state, so on in my state of Texas. If you found yourself in a contract dispute, trust me, you'd be okay in a Hong Kong court. Very efficient court system, well-trained judges, impartial, not corrupt. I'd rather end up in a Hong Kong court any day over a Texas court, no question about that. I don't know anything about the Illinois courts, so I'm not going to speculate, but I suspect it's true as well. What's the tariff rate in Hong Kong? Fair question, 0. They don't have any tariffs at all, none at all. Open free trade, no tariffs, no customs duties. You can import and export anything into and out of Hong Kong with little or no interference. Regulations. They just did create a minimum wage. I'm mad about that. One of the regulations that we track is minimum wages. It's a regulation in labor markets. And they didn't have one until just about 2 years ago. It's actually $2.50 an hour. So the average income in Hong Kong is $40,000. So trust me, very, very, very few Hong Kong workers find themselves working for the minimum wage. It's almost a symbolic thing more than anything else. So Hong Kong is number 1, Singapore is number 2, and Singapore in many ways is structurally similar to Hong Kong. They also have no tariffs at all, for example. This does highlight the point that this is an economic freedom index, not a political freedom index. I love political freedom. I'm a big fan. I love my freedom of speech. I use it every day. Right? But there are other indexes of political freedom. The Freedom House in New York is a great group. Go to their website. It's a wonderful group. They do indexes every year of political freedom and civil liberties, and I love civil liberties also. I'm a libertarian. I like civil liberties. I like them all. Right? But our index is just narrowly focused on economic stuff, because no one had done an economic freedom index until we came along. So Singapore does well, although if I was giving it a more complete freedom score, as opposed to just an economic freedom score, they would suffer a bit, because as you know, it's not exactly the most liberal democracy and not the highest respect for freedom of speech and civil liberties as other places. And the same can be true of a couple of the other countries on the list. But generally speaking, the countries at the top are market economies, relatively what we would think of as being, industrial market economies. The big news and sort of the headline for the talk, I guess, is the United States has fallen to 17th in the index. The United States had traditionally been number 3. Hong Kong, Singapore, the United States, year after year after year. We put this index every year, numbers in the computer every year. Hong Kong, Singapore, US. For a decade, I'm putting these numbers in. We had dated back to the 1970s. Always Hong Kong, Singapore, US. Until the year 2000.